The silence was the first thing that told me something had gone wrong. Not a comfortable silence. Not the ordinary quiet of a border settlement morning, when the generators hum low and the supply birds haven't lifted off yet, and you can hear the wind moving through the antenna arrays. This was a different kind. This was the silence of a room where all the clocks have stopped at the same moment and no one has come to wind them again. I noticed it the way you notice a smell. Gradually, then all at once, then you can't stop noticing it. I was in the back of the medical tent when it happened. Not the dramatic part of the tent, not the triage bay or the consultation row, but the supply annex, a sagging canvas extension off the main structure that I had been using as a combination storage room, and on long watch nights, a place to sit alone and eat field rations without anyone needing something from me for 10 minutes. I was cross-legged on a supply crate, eating cold protein paste from the foil with a spoon, reading a diagnostic manual I had already read 4 times, when the main structure shuddered around me. Not an explosion, not exactly, more like a pressure wave, as if the air had been grabbed by something enormous and shaken once, hard, and then released. My cup of water fell off the crate beside me. The lantern swung. The manual slid off my knee. Then nothing. I sat there for 3 full seconds, which in field medicine is an eternity, before my training moved my body for me. I was through the connecting flap and into the main tent in a single motion, left hand already going for the emergency broadcast unit on the equipment table, right hand checking the stethoscope around my neck out of pure habit, the way a soldier checks their weapon when a door opens. The tent was empty. That alone should have told me everything. We had 11 patients that morning. 7 Orrathi civilians from the border village 2 kilometers east, 2 adults and 5 children, admitted over the previous week for everything from respiratory infections to a compound fracture. 3 human relief workers who had picked up a gastrointestinal strain from the water supply. And 1 CAREV trader who had taken a bad fall from a loading platform and cracked 2 ribs. The tent should not have been empty. But it was. I went through the triage bay, through the consultation row, back to the entrance, calling names. I am not someone who calls out in a crisis, field training drills that reflex out of you in year 2. But I called out anyway, because the tent was empty, and the silence outside it was wrong, and something in me needed to hear a voice, even if it was my own. Nothing. I stepped through the entrance flap and looked out at Second Station. There was not much left of it. The settlement covered roughly 2 square kilometers at its largest extent, the medical tent and its annexes at the near end, then a row of prefabricated hab units where the relief staff lived, then the marketplace, then the larger permanent structures toward the center, the water processing plant, the communications tower, the transit depot. Beyond that, the border village access road winding east between low, pale hills. What I was looking at from the tent entrance did not match that map. The hab units were still standing mostly. The marketplace framework was intact. The communications tower was still up. But everything looked wrong in the way that a room looks wrong after someone has moved every piece of furniture 6 centimeters to the left. The geometry was the same, but the life was gone. No movement. No figures on the access road. No sound from the water plant. The transit depot doors were open, and I could see from 200 meters away that there was nothing moving inside them. And on the ground between the prefabs and the medical tent, there was a scattering of personal items, a jacket, a child's shoe, a food container, the ordinary debris of people leaving in a hurry. I stood in the entrance of the tent for a long moment. The air had a quality I recognized and did not like, a slight bitterness, a faint chemical warmth that had nothing to do with the temperature. I had smelled it once before, on a humanitarian attachment to a conflict zone 3 systems out, when a dispersal agent had been used on a settlement, and the investigators were already too late when they arrived. I had stood at the edge of that settlement and smelled that smell. I went back inside and sealed the entrance. I did not know yet what had happened. I did not know whether it was a weapon, an accident, a cascading industrial failure from the water plant. I did not know who was left or where they had gone or whether the people in the HAB units were alive or dead. I knew only what my nose and my training and 15 years of field work were telling me. The air outside was not safe to breathe without filtration for any sustained period. The settlement had been emptied fast, and whatever had happened within the last 40 minutes because I had been inside the supply annex with the flap sealed and had not noticed until the pressure wave. I found a respirator in the emergency kit and fitted it, and then I went back to the supply annex and sat down on the crate again and thought. It took me 11 minutes to make a plan. I know because I checked the time when I sat down and again when I stood up. 11 minutes is not a long time to make a plan, but it is long enough if you do it properly. I have been in worse situations where I had 30 seconds. The discipline is the same. Assess what you know, assess what you have, assess what the next 4 hours look like, identify the single most important thing, and do that thing first. What I knew, the air was compromised, the settlement was evacuated or worse, I was alone, and I had no outgoing signal. I had tried the emergency broadcast twice before I sat down and got nothing but carrier static. What I had, the full supply inventory of a standard outfitted border medical tent, including 9 days' worth of field rations for 20 people, a working water filtration unit, emergency power cells sufficient for 14 days at minimal draw, 2 respirators, a partial box of filtration masks, 12 liters of broad-spectrum anticontaminant wash, a portable diagnostic unit, and a full medical kit. What the next 4 hours looked like. Unknown threat, no communication, no transport, no other people. The single most important thing, I was wrong about being alone. I found her on the 3rd bed in the triage bay. She had been there all along. I had looked directly at that bed when I came through the first time and not seen her because she was so small, and the thermal emergency blanket I had tucked around her the previous evening had flattened her profile completely. She was Orrathi, chalk-white skin, the bony ridge structure of her brow catching the overhead light, her long, narrow ears folded back along her skull in the way Orrathi children did when they were deeply asleep. She was maybe 4 years old, maybe younger. The gill slits along the sides of her neck, 3 on each side, pale and translucent, moved with her breathing in the slow flutter of deep sleep. Her name, as best as I could approximate it in standard, was something like Essa. The Orrathi name was several tones lower than my vocal range. Her parents had admitted her 6 days earlier with a respiratory infection that I had been treating with standard antivirals. She had been improving. The previous evening, before my shift ended, she had been awake long enough to eat some broth and regard me with the enormous amber eyes that Orrathi children had, that particular quality of attention that made you feel simultaneously observed and trusted. I sat on the edge of the bed. I put one hand very lightly over her hand under the blanket. She stirred but did not wake. The gill slits fluttered once and settled. I sat there for a moment and felt the weight of what I was holding. Then I got up and went back to work. The first thing I did was check her vitals. They were stable. Temperature slightly elevated, still carrying residue of the infection, but trending in the right direction. Oxygen saturation acceptable. The antivirals were doing their job. I made a note in her chart, which sounds absurdly procedural given the circumstances, but habit is its own kind of discipline, and I have seen field medics come apart because they stopped doing the small procedures. The forms exist to keep you human. I filled in the time and the readings, and set the chart at the foot of the bed. The second thing I did was begin the internal seal on the tent. The medical tent at Second Station was built to function in contamination scenarios, standard issue for border postings in contested atmospheric zones. It had a filtration intake, a positive pressure system for the interior, and sealing strips around every entry point. I had never had cause to use them before. I unsealed the kit from behind the supply cabinet, read the instructions once, and then spent 45 minutes sealing every flap, every vent, every point of external contact. When I was done, the inside of the tent had its own internal pressure, and the filtration unit was pulling clean air through the intake, and cycling it at a rate that would keep us comfortable indefinitely. I sat down on the edge of the cot across from Essa and took off the respirator. The air was clear. She woke up while I was eating my second attempt at a field ration. Lunch, technically, though the concept of lunch had become somewhat theoretical. Her eyes opened fully, which was the Orrathi version of a gradual waking process. No bleary half-consciousness, no slow surfacing. One moment asleep, the next fully present. She looked at the ceiling of the tent. Then she looked at me. I held still. I had learned in the 6 days since her admission that sudden movement startled her badly. Not the childish fright of unexpected noise, but something older and more specific. A flinch that reached all the way to her gill slits, which would clamp flat when she was frightened in a way that I suspected was instinctive rather than voluntary. I said in the Orrathi greeting I had learned from her parents, "The day is quiet." She stared at me. I said it again. I had been practicing the tonal drop on the second syllable, and was fairly sure I had it now. Her gill slits fluttered, not the clamped fright response, but the looser, uncertain movement that I had learned to read as something like tentative acknowledgement. I pointed at the tray of broth I had heated on the portable unit. She looked at it. I slid it slowly across the equipment table toward her, well within her reach but not pressed on her. Then I went back to my own food and did not look at her directly. It took her about 3 minutes to sit up and reach for the tray. I pretended to be very interested in my field ration. This was day 1. I did not know at that point that anyone was coming. I did not know that the absence of an evacuation for us for the tent, for the 2 patients still inside it when whatever happened outside happened, was not an oversight. I was treating it as an oversight. I was treating it as something went wrong, the evacuation was chaotic, they missed us, they will come back when they can. This is what I told myself on day 1. It is not a comfortable thing to admit, in retrospect, that I constructed a narrative that kept me functional, but that is what I did. The alternative was a kind of paralysis I could not afford. The signal drone appeared on the second day. I was outside for 6 minutes on the morning of day 2, suited up, respirator on, conducting a visual assessment of the settlement perimeter, when I saw it. Small, maybe 40 centimeters across, matte gray, moving in a slow grid pattern about 20 meters above the settlement. Not a relief drone, not a search and rescue pattern. The grid was methodical in a way that had nothing to do with finding survivors. It was the pattern of a unit looking for something specific and cataloging what it found. I watched it for 2 minutes from the edge of the tent entrance, standing still and behind the shadow of the entrance frame. The drone passed directly over the tent. It slowed. Its sensor cluster, a ring of instrumentation along its lower rim, rotated downward. Then it continued on its grid and moved out over the prefab units. I went inside and sealed the entrance again. I sat in the supply annex for a long time. I thought about what kind of organization sends a cataloging drone over a compromised settlement before it sends any kind of rescue team. I thought about what kind of organization would find a pattern in an event like this, rather than survivors. I thought about the signal drone's markings, which I had recognized. A clean white lozenge on a gray field. The inspectorate. The inspectorate. I had dealt with them once before, on a different posting, in an administrative capacity, permit renewals, supply manifests, a quarterly review that had taken 3 days longer than it should have. They were bureaucratic in the way that a scalpel is bureaucratic, precise, cold, and designed to cut. On that posting, a colleague had told me, with the careful manner of someone who says something once and does not repeat it, that the inspectorate's mandate extended further than administration when the administration required it. I had not asked him to elaborate. Sitting in the supply annex, I elaborated it myself. The air outside had been compromised. The settlement had been emptied, not evacuated, because an evacuation leaves residue, people coming back for belongings, the orderly chaos of a relief effort, transport vehicles, the noise of organized human activity. What happened to Second Station left a child's shoe and a food container, and the silence of a room where all the clocks stopped. The inspectorate was now flying cataloging drones over it. I thought about what they were cataloging. Then I thought about the small chalk-white child in the triage bay, who was currently sitting up in her cot with the thermal blanket around her shoulders, working her way with great concentration through a second cup of broth, her enormous amber eyes tracking the movements of my hands as I moved through the tent. I thought about the fact that she had been here, that she had breathed this air, that she had seen whatever the settlement's people had seen in those last minutes, even if her seeing had been from a sick bed in a sealed tent. I thought about the drone sensor cluster rotating toward the tent's roof. I stood up. I went back into the triage bay. I sat down on the cot across from her and looked at her. She looked back at me. She had a pendant around her neck, something she had been wearing when she was admitted, a small carved piece of pale yellowish wood about the size of my thumbnail, threaded on a cord of braided plant fiber. I had not removed it during admission because it was small and flat and posed no clinical interference, and something about the way her hand went to it when she was uncertain had told me that removing it would be unkind. She was touching it now, the way she did when she wasn't sure of something. I thought, they are going to find out the tent survived, and when they find that out, they are going to want to know what survived inside it. I said very quietly in her language, or as close to her language as I could manage, I will not let them take you. She did not understand the words. Orrathi tonality is complex and my pronunciation was imperfect, and she was not old enough to have learned standard. But she watched my face while I said it, with the absolute focused attention that very small children give to things that feel important, and when I was done, she put both hands around the broth cup and continued drinking. I took that as a receipt. This was day 2. On day 2, I also began to understand the tent better than I had when I was using it for medicine. The medical tent at Second Station was, as I said, sealed against contamination scenarios. What this also meant was that it was, in several practical respects, not visible from outside. The filtration intake ran underground, a buried intake pipe that surfaced 40 meters away in a drainage cut behind the prefabs. The outer surface of the tent was a composite material that scattered sensor returns in a way originally intended to prevent medical personnel's equipment from interfering with settlement communication systems. The thermal signature of 2 living bodies, 1 adult, 1 child, was designed to be undetectable from outside when the tent was in sealed mode. We had sealed mode. I did not know whether the inspectorate's drones were sophisticated enough to see through that scatter. I assumed they might be and planned accordingly. Accordingly meant no electronic output. I powered down everything that emitted: the diagnostic unit, the portable comm, the emergency broadcast. I kept only the filtration system, the water unit, and the portable thermal unit that kept S's core temperature stable, all of which were buried in the composite scatter. We ate cold rations. We used no lights after dark. I learned to move through the tent by feel and memory, which is not as difficult as it sounds if you've spent enough time in field postings where power conservation was mandatory. Essa adapted to it faster than I did. She had grown up in a border village, which is to say she had grown up in a place where making do was the default mode, and she seemed to find my methodical preparation interesting rather than alarming. She watched me work with the same concentrated attention she gave everything, her legs folded under her on the cot, the pendant in her hand. When I finished a task, She would look at the result for a moment and then nod once, in the short definitive way her people had of indicating that something met their standards. I noticed that she never once asked me, through gesture or expression or the low Orrathi tone she used when she was processing something, whether we would be all right. She observed. She assessed. She nodded at conclusions. She had the equanimity of someone who has learned early that asking a question you cannot answer costs energy better spent preparing for whatever comes next. 4 years old and already running that calculus. Border villages produce a particular kind of person, I thought. Perhaps so do medical tents. It made me feel, which was slightly inconvenient under the circumstances. The first sweep team came on the afternoon of day 2. I was in the supply annex when I heard the boots, not close 30, 40 meters away on the other side of the prefabs, but the sound carried in the silence of the dead settlement, and I recognized the rhythm of a tactical sweep. 3-count intervals, stop and listen, move. 2 or 3 individuals. Methodical. Not urgent, which told me they were confident, which told me they didn't expect to find anything. I went to the triage bay in the dark. Essa was awake. In the darkness I could see the faint amber luminescence of her eyes, an Orrathi trait I had not known about until I first saw it, which had startled me considerably, and which she had found my reaction to somewhat amusing. She was sitting up still. I sat beside her on the cot and put my arm around her shoulders. She was very small inside it. I put my other hand over hers, very lightly, in the pressure greeting I had learned was her species version of "I am here, you are not alone." The gill slits on her neck fluttered once and then settled, slow and even. We sat in the dark. The boots came closer. I heard them stop. I heard the muffled sound of someone speaking into a comm unit, a short report, the words inaudible. Then the boots turned and moved away, back toward the prefab row, and in a few minutes I couldn't hear them at all. The silence came back. I sat there with Essa in the dark and listened to it. When I was certain the sweep team was gone, I eased away from her and went back to the supply annex and sat down on the crate. My hands were steady. They are usually steady. But for a moment, in the dark, sitting on that crate, I pressed them flat against my thighs and breathed very deliberately, the way you breathe in field medicine when something has gone closer than you would have liked, and you need to get your heart rate down before you make any decisions. I thought the scatter worked. They didn't see the tent's footprint. Then I thought they'll be back. They are thorough, these people. They will finish the grid and find the perimeter and realize there is a structure on the settlement edge they have not yet cleared, and they will come back. I had 4 days of food, maybe 5 if I stretched the rations. After that, I had no plan. On day 3, I started making one. I also, because there was no one to see me do it, allowed myself 1 hour of something that was not quite grief and not quite fear, but occupied the same region of the chest. I sat in the supply annex, and I let myself think about the 11 people who had been in the tent when the pressure wave hit and where they were now, and about the settlement's families in the HAB units, and about the border village 2 kilometers east, and about the silence that was their collective absence. You cannot carry the mathematics of a thing like that, the numbers defeat you, but you can hold the specific, which is all that field training ever really asks of you. Hold the specific. The specific is what you have. When the hour was up, I stopped and washed my face with a ration of water from the filtration unit and went back to work. You can take exactly what time you need for the thing you cannot not feel, and then you get up. This is not callousness. Callousness is never being in the room with it at all. I have been in that room. The hour is how you close the door behind you properly rather than just walking away and letting it stand open to drain the air. I was telling myself this partly for my own benefit and partly, I think, for no one's benefit at all. There was only Essa to hear it, and she was asleep, and she didn't need my philosophy. She needed her antivirals and her broth and the consistent presence of a human body in the tent with her, which seemed to satisfy something in her that I wasn't going to examine too closely because I had already spent my hour. The settlement's communications tower was still standing. I had assessed it from the entrance on day one, intact physically, but I hadn't known the status of its uplink. The tower's base unit was inside the settlement proper, in a service shed attached to the water plant. To reach it, I would need to cross 200 meters of open settlement in a respirator and sealed suit, during the window between drone passes, and then have enough technical knowledge to operate a dedicated planetary uplink I had never personally used. I had used one like it, on a posting 4 years earlier on a different border world, where the communications infrastructure was the same standard-issue design that CONSU, the Civilian Supply Authority, used across all its border settlements. Same manufacturer, same manual probably. I had helped a communications tech troubleshoot the uplink on that posting over a 12-hour period, during which I had learned considerably more about dedicated planetary uplinks than any medic has a professional reason to know. I thought 4 years ago is a long time, but the design hasn't changed. It never changes. They've been using the same unit for 20 years because procurement doesn't move fast and the thing works. I thought I can do this. I ran the numbers on the drone passes first. I had timed 3 of them from the sealed entrance, watching through the tent's diagnostic port, which was shielded and did not emit. The drones moved in a consistent 17-minute grid, with a 6-minute gap between the trailing edge of one pass and the leading edge of the next. 6 minutes to cross 200 meters, reach the service shed, get inside, make contact, and return was not 6 minutes I had. But the drones also had to swing wide to cover the eastern perimeter, which I had observed added approximately 9 minutes to the cycle on every third pass. I calculated, third cycle gap 15 minutes, cross in 4 minutes at a walk that doesn't produce visual noise, 8 minutes at the tower, 3 minutes back. On day 3, with Essa sleeping and the tent sealed, I did a gear check, respirator, sealed suit from the contamination kit, water canteen, one small tool kit from the supply cabinet, the manual for the uplink unit, which I had found in the settlement's administrative folder on the tent's local data tablet and had read twice and memorized to the best of my ability. I did not sleep that night. This was not a decision. My body simply declined. On the morning of day 4, I went. I will compress this. Crossing the settlement was the worst 4 minutes I have spent in a long time. Not because I was frightened, but that was background noise, the constant static of a field posting that does not change the actual frequency of events. Because of what I walked through, the settlement was not destroyed. It was worse than destroyed. It was empty in a way that had texture to it, that had specific gravity. The personal items on the ground, the food containers and open doors and the hab units with their windows still intact, and the lights still on inside some of them from the morning that had not finished. Someone had been cooking. I could smell it through the respirator, a faint ghost of it, the trace of something that had been warm and ordinary 20 minutes before the world changed. I walked through it and I did not stop, and I did not let myself look too long at any single thing, because the task was the tower. And if I stopped moving, I was going to have to feel something about what I was seeing, and I did not have the time. The service shed was unlocked. The uplink unit was standard issue exactly as I remembered. I found the control panel, ran the power on sequence, checked the uplink status, and found, to my particular relief, that the tower itself had not been damaged. The uplink was operational. I had 8 minutes. I used 6 of them on the call. The channel I found was not a CONSU emergency frequency. It was a civilian aid frequency, one of the independent relief networks that operated in the border zones, largely outside official channels, staffed and funded by a coalition of species advocacy groups. I knew about these networks the way any field medic on a border posting knows about them. Officially, they did not exist in any documentation I had ever filed. Unofficially, they had gotten 3 people I knew off 2 different postings when the official channels had failed. I had a frequency number memorized, because a colleague had given it to me 4 years ago and said, "Keep this in the same place you keep your name." The voice that answered was female and Orrathi accented, and did not waste words. I said, "Medical tent, second station border posting, 2 survivors, 1 adult human, 1 Orrathi child, 4 years of age, recovering from respiratory infection." I said, "The inspectorate is running sweep teams." I said, "I need extraction for the child." I said, "I have supplies for 2 more days and then that calculation changes." The voice said, "Call sign." I gave the name of the colleague who had given me the frequency. Silence on the line for 4 seconds. Then, 2 nights. Come to the drainage cut behind the northeastern prefabs, after 3rd dark. I said, "I know where the drainage cut is." She said, "Bring only the child and what she can carry herself, nothing else." The line closed. I had 2 minutes left of my window. I sat for a moment in the service shed with the uplink unit and the ghost smell of someone's interrupted cooking and the weight of what I had just arranged. I was not going to think about the last part of what the contact had said. I would think about it when I had to. I went back across the settlement in 3 minutes flat. Essa was awake when I came through the entrance flap. She was sitting up in her cot with the pendant in both hands and her eyes on the entrance, and when I came through, she exhaled, not dramatically, not in the exaggerated way of a child's relief, but in the quiet way of someone who had been very still for a long time and was now permitting themselves to stop being quite so still. I sat on the cot across from her. I poured water from my canteen and handed her the cup and took a drink from the canteen myself. We sat in the quiet of the sealed tent. I looked at the pendant in her hands. She had been admitted with it 6 days ago. Her mother had been holding her hand during the admission interview, and during the whole interview the child had had the pendant in her free hand, and when the mother said something to her in Orrathi, something low and tonal that I couldn't parse, the child had looked at the pendant and then at her mother, and then at the tent around her with the expression of someone receiving a serious piece of information and deciding to take it seriously. I thought about the contact's voice on the line. Bring only the child and what she can carry herself. I thought about 2 more days. I thought, all right. I started teaching her things that afternoon. Not language, there wasn't time for language. Things, practical things, where the water came from using gestures, how to use the filtration mask, which I drilled with her until she could fit it herself in the dark, the difference between the sound of the drone and the sound of something else, by playing recordings from the diagnostic unit's audio log until she could identify the drone's tone in 2 seconds. Where to go the supply annex, against the interior wall, if she heard that tone and I was not in the tent. I made her show me 3 times, and the 3rd time she went to the right spot without hesitation and sat down on the floor with her back against the wall, the mask in her lap, and looked at me with those enormous amber eyes in an expression that I had started to read as, "I understand, I am taking this seriously, you can proceed." She learned the same way I had learned field medicine, by watching once, repeating until the motion was in her body, and then waiting for the next thing. She was very good at waiting. On the evening of day 4, the 2nd sweep team came. This time they came inside the perimeter. I heard the boots differently, closer, with the specific resonance of someone moving on the tent's composite mat groundwork, which was distinct from the settlement's compacted earth. I had the lights down. We were in the triage bay, both of us on her cot, and I had my arm around her and her hand in mine, and we were entirely still. The sweep team walked around the tent. They didn't try the entrance seal, or if they did, they tried it once and found it sealed and made their note and moved on, because the footsteps moved to the other end and then stopped, and I heard again the sound of a short calm report, and then the boots moved away. After they were gone, Essa sat up and looked at me in the dark, amber eyes finding my face without difficulty. She held up the pendant in one hand and pointed at me with one long, narrow finger. I didn't know what she meant by it. I reached out and touched the pendant very gently, not taking it, just acknowledging it. She watched my face, then she closed her hand around it again and lay back down. I stayed awake the rest of that night. There was nothing clinically wrong with her. I stayed awake because it costs nothing, and it is the only thing a person can do with insomnia besides waste it. Day 5 was quiet. The drones ran their pattern. No sweep teams. I checked Essa's vitals 3 times. The infection was nearly gone, another 2 days of antivirals and she would be entirely clear. I extended the course from the tent's supply, which would see her through a week past the handover. I packed them into a small medical kit, with instructions written in standard notation and Orrathi phonetic script side by side, which I was not certain she could read, but which she might be able to show to someone who could. I want to be precise about day 5, because it is the day I have thought about most since. Not because anything dramatic happened. It was the quietest of the days, nothing from outside, nothing requiring a decision, but precisely because of that. Day 5 was a day of pure ordinary, to the extent that anything in that sealed tent was ordinary, and there is a way in which the ordinary is harder to describe than the things that require action. She helped me. I don't mean she contributed to any practical task in a meaningful way. She was very young and recovering from a respiratory infection in a sealed tent in a dead settlement. What I mean is that she helped me in the way that very small people help by existing with great deliberateness, by eating with full attention and sleeping without complaint, and watching me work with those amber eyes in a way that made the work feel worth doing. I have done field postings alone before. I know what it looks like inside you when there is no one present. Day 5 did not look like that, and the reason it did not look like that was the small person on the cot across the tent. This is not a complicated observation. It is simply true. I made her eat well. She had an appetite, which was a good sign. I heated 2 rations at once on the portable unit. Field cuisine does not exactly sing, but warmth counts for something, and we sat together at the equipment table and ate. She had a deliberate way of eating, very focused, as though the meal deserved her full attention. I found it restful to watch. In the afternoon, I combed her hair. This started as a clinical observation. She had some matting from 5 days in a sickbed that I was concerned could become a scalp issue, and became something else. She sat very still while I worked through it with the small comb from the medical kit. Orrathi hair, I found, was finer than human hair and grew in a pattern I hadn't seen before, and it took careful work. She endured it patiently for about 4 minutes, and then she began to hum, not loudly. A quiet, low sound, more felt than heard, in the tonal range that Orrathi used for personal things. I did not know what it meant. I thought it probably meant that she was tolerating my fumbling attempts at her hair because she was a composed and generous child, and that the humming was the Orrathi version of giving someone credit. When I was done, she turned and looked at me and touched her own hair and nodded once. The short, definitive nod. I said, "You're welcome." She looked at me for a moment with those amber eyes, and then she smiled. Orrathi smiles are not quite like human smiles. The musculature is different. The expression sits further back in the face, more in the eyes than the mouth, but I had been around her long enough to know what I was seeing. I had been around her long enough that it landed in my chest, with a weight I had been carefully not examining. 2 nights. Come to the drainage cut behind the northeastern prefabs, after 3rd dark. Tonight was the night. I thought about this for approximately 45 minutes in the supply annex, while Essa slept in the triage bay. I did not let myself think about it for longer than that, because thinking too long about things of this shape is not something I have ever found productive. The thinking leads you around the same circle until the circle is a rut, and then you stop moving. What I thought in those 45 minutes was, she is alive. She will be with her own people. They will know her language and her food and the exact quality of her particular Orrathi silence, which is different from every other silence I have ever encountered in 15 years of field postings. A silence with weight and attention in it. A silence that is not the absence of something but the presence of it. They will know how to be in that silence with her. I thought this is the correct outcome. I thought I know that. I thought knowing that does not make the next 4 hours simple, but it makes them possible, which is what I need from it. I went and sat beside her cot and watched her sleep for a few minutes. The gill slits moved in their slow, even flutter. The pendant was in her hand, she slept with it. I had noticed, always, the cord looped twice around her small fingers so it wouldn't fall. I packed the medical kit. I packed a blanket. I wrote the instructions for the antivirals in both scripts, folded the sheet, and put it in the kit beside the medication. I put the kit on the cot beside her and sat back and looked at what I had arranged. Then I woke her. She came awake in the same instantaneous way, fully present, and looked at me, looked at the kit, looked back at me. I said in her language as clearly as I could manage, "Time to walk." She considered this. Then she sat up and began, without prompting, to pull on her outer robe. She had been wearing the medical smock for days, and I had given her a robe from the settlement storage, which was too large for her but warmer, with the focused efficiency of someone who had been told a thing, and taken it seriously, and was now acting on it. I helped her with the clasps, she let me. We went out through the entrance on the northern face of the tent, the side furthest from the settlement center, the side that faced the drainage cut. I had checked the drone cycle 3 times through the diagnostic port that evening. We had 18 minutes. The air outside was cold. I had the respirator on. She had the filtration mask fitted, which she had done herself correctly in the dark, because I had drilled her on it. Her hand found mine without any prompting and held it, not the grip of a frightened child, but something steadier, more deliberate, the pressure greeting extended in the walking version. We walked. The drainage cut was 220 meters from the tent entrance, along the northern perimeter, through a low channel of scrub vegetation that had not been part of the settlement proper. No open ground, no sight lines from the prefabs. I had walked it in my head a dozen times. I walked it now with Essa's hand in mine, picking our way through the scrub in the dark, and the settlement was quiet around us, and above us the sky was a different color than Earth's sky. A deep, particular blue-green with unfamiliar stars, the way border world skies always are, and I did not look at it for long because I was watching the ground. The contact was already there. 2 figures Orrathi in the drainage cut, one taller, wrapped in a worker's coat, one shorter, younger. When they saw us coming they held still, the way professionals hold still when they are in a situation that requires stillness. The taller one raised one hand in a gesture I recognized, an Orrathi greeting of protection, both palms outward, the offering of no harm, and I returned it, which seemed to surprise them briefly. The taller one looked at Essa, and Essa looked at the taller one. I felt her hand tighten around mine, not in fear. The gill slits on her neck did not clamp. It was something else, something that I had not seen before. Recognition, maybe, or the beginning of it. The taller Orrathi said something in the low tonal language, something I couldn't follow, and Essa answered, a single short phrase, and the taller one made a sound I had come to understand as an Orrathi expression of relief. The shorter figure, young, maybe 12, came forward and took the medical kit from me and said, in accented but clean standard, "The medication instructions." I said in the kit, 2 scripts follow the full course. She said, "We will." The taller one looked at me directly and said, in standard, "You held her." I said, "She's a patient, it's my job." The taller one regarded me for a moment with the kind of expression that I could not fully read. Orrathi expression is specific, and I had only a limited vocabulary for it, and then inclined their head, which I understood. Essa had not moved from my side. I looked down at her. She was looking up at me, the pendant in her free hand. She had had it out since we left the tent, I realized, had been holding it the whole walk. She held it up to me. I shook my head. I touched the pendant and closed her fingers around it and shook my head again. She looked at me with those amber eyes in the particular way she had that I could not fully describe and that I had not been prepared for, and that I was not going to be able to think about clearly for some time afterward. Then she pressed it into my palm, not offering it, closing my fingers over it, the way you press something into someone's hand when you want them to know they are carrying something. I held it. She stepped away from me and took the younger Orrathi's hand. The taller one moved to cover both of them, and the three of them began moving south along the drainage cut, away from the settlement, into the dark. The younger one looked back once. Essa did not look back. She walked the way she had done everything, fully present, forward-facing, entirely herself. In a minute I couldn't see them. I stood in the drainage cut, with the pendant in my hand. I stayed there until the drone cycle came around, which was 12 minutes, and then I moved back toward the tent because standing in an open drainage cut during a drone sweep is a poor tactical choice. I went back through the scrub and in through the northern entrance and let it seal behind me. I sat down in the supply annex on the crate and took off the respirator and breathed the filtered air of the sealed tent. The tent was quiet. I opened my hand and looked at the pendant. Pale yellowish wood, carved into a shape I didn't recognize, something organic, curved, perhaps an animal form from the Orrathi border world that I had never visited. The cord was braided plant fiber, worn smooth with handling. Not worn smooth with her handling. Worn smooth over a long time, which meant it was old, which meant it had been someone else's before it was hers. Something kept and passed. Now mine, apparently, or mine to hold. I sat with it in my hand for a while. The tent was quiet. The filtration system breathed steadily. Outside, at intervals, I heard the distant tone of the drone working its grid, looking for things to catalog, finding an empty settlement and an empty tent, and whatever it needed to find there. I sat and let it look. On day 6, I began the process of re-establishing communication with CONSU through official channels. A slower, more careful process, with proper documentation, a formal incident report, a contamination disclosure. The kind of paperwork that creates a record. I was thorough about it, because I have found that thoroughness in documentation is the only reliable counter to organizations that prefer things to remain uncatalogued. I filed the child as discharged on the appropriate date, day 1, when the evacuation happened, in the chaos of which one small Orrathi patient had been separated from her family in circumstances consistent with the general disorder of an emergency evacuation. I filed this factually and specifically, and in the format CONSU required. A child discharged, reunited with family during evacuation. I did not have a family name. I listed her by the name I had, approximated in standard and the clinical description, and the discharge date and the state of her treatment. I noted the medication she was on and the remaining course and the instructions provided. I was very thorough, I always am. The extraction team from CONSU arrived on day 8, and by then the contamination had dispersed enough that the respirator was precautionary rather than essential, and the settlement looked in the morning light exactly the way I knew it would look. Empty, quiet, the debris of an interrupted day scattered on the ground, the HAB units with their lights off now, the water plant silent. The extraction team asked me questions for several hours. I answered them factually and in the format they required. They asked about survivors. I described the orderly discharge of my last patient on day 1, in the confusion of the evacuation. They asked if I had witnessed the nature of the event that had emptied the settlement. I said that I had been in a sealed supply annex when the event occurred and had not directly observed it, which was true. They asked if I had made any unauthorized communications during the period I was in the tent. I said that the emergency broadcast unit had malfunctioned due to damage, which it had. The unit I had tried on day one had been giving carrier static, as I had noted in my log, which I showed them. They filed their report. They did not ask me to open my hand. I think about her sometimes when I'm on postings like the one I have now, another border world, another tent, another row of cots. I think about the gill slits in their slow, easy flutter and the amber eyes, and the single definitive nod she gave when a thing had been done to her satisfaction. I think about walking through that dead settlement with her hand in mine, and the unfamiliar stars overhead, and the way she looked at the drainage cut contact, and said one short phrase, and the contact made the sound of relief. The pendant is in my left chest pocket. I have had it there since the drainage cut. It is not decorative, and it is not a good luck charm, and it is not a comfort object, which are all things people have suggested when they see me take it out and turn it over in my fingers on slow watch nights. It is a receipt. She pressed it into my hand because she wanted me to know I was carrying something. Not a debt, not a claim, something more specific than either of those words can hold. The way a small chalk-white child with amber eyes and gill slits that flutter when she breathes can press a piece of worn wood into a field medic's palm and make the medic understand without language that she knew what was done for her and she was taking it with her and she was leaving this in its place. I turned it over in my fingers. Pale yellowish wood, a shape I still don't recognize. I have asked 2 Orrathi I have worked with since then what the shape is. Both of them looked at it for a moment and then at me and then said, in their way, it doesn't translate. I carry it because that is also my way. The inspectorate filed their report eventually. I read the public version. Second station, a border world civilian settlement, no affiliation with the contested resource corridor, routine decommission due to atmospheric contamination from an undetermined industrial event. Residents successfully evacuated prior to event with no reported casualties. 1 CONSU field medic sheltered in place for 8 days before extraction. No medical events of note. Settlement to be decommissioned, and land returned to regional authority. No reported casualties. I read that line 3 times. Then I closed the file and went back to work. There is a calculus in field medicine that they teach you early and you spend the rest of your career understanding better. You cannot save everyone. You know this from the first year. You learn to do the triage, which is a word that means sorting, and what it means in practice is, you look at what you have and you look at what is in front of you, and you make the best possible decision with the information available, and then you act, and then you live with it. I have been doing this calculus for 15 years. I have learned that the calculus does not get easier with practice. What gets easier is trusting that the calculus was the right process even when the result is not the result you wanted. What gets easier is picking up the chart and writing the next entry and continuing. I wrote my entry, I carried what I was carrying, I went back to work. 1 small chalk-white child with amber eyes is somewhere in the border networks, continuing. The medication course was sufficient. The instructions were written in 2 scripts. The people who took her from me in the drainage cut knew her language and her silence, and had the expression of people who were bringing something home. That is what I know. That is the entry in the chart. That is the whole of the calculation and the whole of the result, and the whole of what I will say about it. Except this. They looked at that settlement and saw 1 field medic and 1 small child, and they decided the math was simple. They were wrong about the math. They are always wrong about the math, these people, when they look at a human being and a child in their care and think, easy. They look at the equipment and the post and the resource picture, and they do not look at the thing I already knew on day 1 when I sat on the edge of that cot and put my hand over her hand and felt the weight of what I was holding. They do not look at what it means to have already decided. I had already decided on day 1. That is the only thing you need to know. By the time they ran their drone over my tent and sent their sweep teams through my settlement perimeter, I had already decided, which meant there was no calculation left for them to interrupt. The decision was made. The weight was being carried. Everything else was just the mechanism. I sat in that supply annex on a crate for 8 days, and I kept one Orrathi child alive, and I got her out and I went back in and I wrote the reports, and I answered the questions, and I closed the file. And in my left chest pocket, against the flat of my sternum, there is a piece of pale yellowish wood worn smooth with long use, and I carry it because she pressed it there, and because it is mine to carry, and because some things do not require a word in any language to be fully and permanently understood. I know what I did. I know what it cost. I know what I brought out of that tent and what I left in that drainage cut and what I carried home. It was enough. It was the right calculation. It was the only one I knew how to make. That is all.